Tonight, the finish line in sight. The House is set to vote on the debt deal, but hurdles remain.
Many progressives, including me, lean no.
Plus, too close for comfort. A Chinese jet buzzes a U.S. spy plane. And a campaign priority for Republicans.
When he was arrested for Kayla's murder, he laughed and smirked.
Highlighted by one mother's heartbreaking plea before Congress.
If we had stricter border policies, my daughter would still be alive today.
All this and more tonight on Faith Nation.
Debt ceiling decision day in the U.S. House of Representatives. Welcome to Faith Nation. I'm John Jessup.
And good evening in Washington. I'm Jenna Browder. A vote to lift the debt ceiling is slated for tonight, but will the measure pass?
We are just 5 days before the United States runs out of money to pay its bills. If the bipartisan measure passes, it's then up to the Senate to send the bill to the president's desk for his signature ahead of Monday's deadline.
CBN News White House correspondent Abigail Robertson is at the White House, where the president says things are going as planned. Abigail?
That's right, Jenna. And as we've seen before in various other dramatic House votes, and we like to talk about, tonight could take a lot of twists and turns with Republicans and Democrats, a handful on each side, strongly opposed to this legislation for very different reasons. But the general consensus is that this is going to pass the House tonight. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy was very confident today that they're going to get this done and argued that Republicans were able to get a lot in this bill throughout the negotiation process. Take a look.
Today, the American people are going to win. We're going to pass the largest cut in American history. It's just a small step putting us on the right track. After today, I'm going to put a commission together to look at the entire budget.
Now, it's not clear right now if House Republicans are going to have the votes to pass the bill on their own. But a fair amount of House Democrats are planning to vote for it, including Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, who emphasized today that they need to get this bill passed to avoid a catastrophic default. Take a look.
And I support it without hesitation, reservation, or trepidation. Not because it's perfect, but in divided government, we, of course, cannot allow the perfect to be the enemy of the good. And President Biden did an incredibly good job under difficult circumstances in protecting some key priorities and values for the well-being of the American people.
Now, if and when the bill passes the House, it will then move on to the Senate, where Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and Minority Leader Mitch McConnell are both urging their colleagues to vote for this bill. And they will need a combination of both Democrats and Republicans to vote for it in order to get it onto the president's desk. And Schumer warns that there is no margin for error or holding up this bill in order to get it done by the June 5th deadline. John, Jenna.
All right, at the White House, Abigail Robertson, thank you very much. Meanwhile, in the 2024 race for the White House, Ron DeSantis is off and running, the Republican candidate digging into the culture wars as a key piece of his campaign.
We have a bureaucracy that our founding fathers would find unrecognizable. We've also witnessed the steady advance of a new form of leftism that has infected institutions across our nation. This form of cultural Marxism sows divisions in our society and devalues merit and achievement. This woke ideology represents a war on truth itself.
DeSantis' remarks come as he embarks on a 3-state campaign blitz. He trails former President Trump in the polls. Trump is targeting DeSantis for failing to stop Disney from, quote, going woke.
And here with us now is Tony Perkins, president of the Family Research Council. Tony, parts of DeSantis and what conservatives call the anti-woke agenda have been stalled by judges for what they say likely being in conflict with the Constitution's 14th and First Amendments. Tony, is it dangerous for DeSantis to stake out his campaign on this agenda since it has yet to play out in the courts, or is there possibly another win with him trying to take on judges as well?
Now, John, I think we've learned from the past that we shouldn't wait for judges to tell us what we should do as policymakers. We need to move ahead with what we know to be right. And, the courts can decide when the time is right. But look, this is where the American people are right now. They want to take on corporate America. They want to take on these woke institutions that are pushing an agenda that is hurting their families, harming their children, and putting the future of this country at risk.
Whether it's abortion, bathroom bans, book bans, culture wars, Tony, really seem to be ginning up the base. After a disappointing midterm for Republicans, though, more pundits and political observers seem to be speaking out, essentially saying Republican candidates need to stick to issues like inflation rather than the social issues. Your thoughts on that?
Well, Jenna, that's what happened in the midterm is they avoided the issues that the American people were hearing about constantly. The Democrats spent about $350 million promoting their position on abortion and defining the Republicans, and the Republicans spent about $35 million. And so if you're going to let the other side define where you stand, you're going to lose every time in a debate. So the Republicans need to embrace these issues and where the party stands. It's historically been pro-family, pro-life, and that is a message that in this divided culture where these cultural wars are raging, it's going to attract support. And that's why Ron DeSantis is doing this.
Tony, back to our top story. We heard in that soundbite from Speaker McCarthy that this debt deal represents the largest cuts in American history, but you have disdain for the debt deal from folks both on the far left and on the far right. Does that suggest that this agreement in some ways is politically fair?
Well, look, when you look at the pre-COVID spending levels of about $4.2 trillion, you see post-COVID spending of $6.2 trillion. And we've now made that emergency spending that we did during COVID as a part of the baseline. That's problematic, and that's what the conservatives are raising questions over. Is it a reduction in spending? Yes, but you have to compare apples to apples, not apples to oranges. And so my big concern here, John and Jen, is that what we've seen over the last few months, unprecedented unity among the Republican conference after a brutal speaker's race, is going to be fractured by this, and the way forward is in question. As I've talked to many members, even today and yesterday, the future of the Republican conference and the unity that they've forged is in question.
Just a few seconds left here, but in your view, how is Speaker McCarthy doing in this battle?
Well, I think up to this point he's done quite well, but I think this puts his leadership to the test and his ability to unify Republicans going forward after, avoiding some of, I think, the biggest issues, and that is the spending and the fact that we're funding a lot of the woke policies of the Biden administration. The president himself says we haven't lost anything. We're going forward with what we've been able to pass in the last 2.5 years. That's problematic for a lot of conservatives.
All right, Tony Perkins, president of the Family Research Council. Thank you, Tony. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tony. An unnecessarily aggressive maneuver. That's how the Pentagon is referring to a Chinese fighter jet flying within 400 feet of a U.S. reconnaissance plane over the South China Sea. Video shows Air Force pilots watching the jet rapidly approach. The U.S. aircraft then faces wild turbulence as it's forced to fly through the wake left by the Chinese plane. A senior defense official says this action shouldn't be thought of as a rogue pilot acting independently, but rather as part of a wider pattern of Chinese aggression in the region.
Mark Montgomery is the director of the Center on Cyber and Technology Innovation at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and he joins us now. Mark, welcome. So how dangerous is a maneuver like this, and do you see this as an escalation in the South China Sea?
Well, first, thank you for having me, Jenna. And you're absolutely right. I mean, this was a U.S. RC-135 plane operating in international airspace on a planned route. What the Chinese J-16 pilot did was incredibly unprofessional and really risk escalatory actions. If there's an unintended consequence from one of these, from a collision. And this isn't the first time, as the Pentagon referred to. This is the second very, very close intercept in the last 6 months of one of these types of aircraft. And the U.S. aircraft has little room. It's a large lumbering aircraft. It has very little room to maneuver. in this kind of intercept dynamic. So really unprofessional actions by the Chinese. This is not how a great power should operate. And China fashions itself a great power and then operates petulantly like this. It really creates a crisis.
Mark, when you take this in consideration, talk about tariffs and also, allegations of human rights abuses, does this represent for the United States and China relations an all-time low?
Well, I do think we're at a point where the United States is finally confronting the China that it has in front of it, not the China that we aspired to have in front of us. And as a result, we're having to take economic actions, as you mentioned. As a result, we're having to monitor them very closely. And that gets to these kind of unprofessional acts. What really worries me is the Chinese will not communicate with their U.S. counterparts. We're not getting the communication at the Department of Defense, or the Department of State, or even the White House level that you expect. You know, when this happened in 2001 with an EP-3 incident around Hainan Island, where the Chinese pilot, in fact, died during the inappropriate intercept, he collided with the U.S. plane. The U.S. plane recovered, and 24 of our airmen were held hostage for several weeks. That was calmed down because we had good communications between the White House, the Department of Defense, State Department, and their counterparts. That doesn't exist today, and it doesn't exist because the Chinese choose not to have it exist.
Mark, I want to ask you about North Korea. It looks to have launched a satellite, which many Korea watchers presume to be a missile test. How much of a threat is North Korea to the world order right now?
Well, certainly, North Korea marries kind of our worst case thing. We acknowledge that they have produced some number of nuclear weapons, and they have some number of intermediate range ballistic missiles and even intercontinental ballistic missiles available to them that can hit portions of the United States and certainly all our allies and partners in the Pacific. So and the fact that they miss on this, they're about a 50% country on missile launches. This was a miss. What was interesting was the fact that they acknowledged the miss right away and said, we'll be right back at it.
All right. Mark, we are unfortunately out of time. Mark Montgomery with Foundation for Defense of Democracies, thank you so much for your time and insights.
Thank you.
A cure for the incurable disease. When we come back, we'll show what's helped more than 80% of patients reverse the effects of Alzheimer's.
A boom of baptisms, spontaneous worship, signs springing up all across America that God is on the move in a big way. CBN presents Revival in America, a special you won't want to miss. Wednesday, May 31st at 8 p.m.
Welcome back. Former First Lady Rosalind Carter has been diagnosed with dementia. The Carter Center says the 95-year-old continues to live happily at home with her husband, enjoying spring in Plains, Georgia, and visits with loved ones. For his part, 39th President Jimmy Carter has been home in hospice care since February. At 98, he is the longest living president, and together, the Carters are the longest ever married presidential couple.
Well, when it comes to cognitive health, Alzheimer's disease tragically robs patients of their memories, their relationships, and even their sense of self, slowly stealing life long before the heart stops beating.
Yeah, but for some, there's hope. An all-natural remedy is helping to reverse the symptoms of Alzheimer's. Medical reporter Lori Johnson has the details.
A number of Alzheimer's patients are describing how they regained their memory after starting the Bredesen protocol. It's not a drug. Instead, it's a number of lifestyle changes, including diet, exercise, and much more, each designed to address the approximately 40 different causes of Alzheimer's.
As you can imagine, I was terrified.
9 years ago, after Julie Gregory got lost on a very familiar road, she soon learned she had Alzheimer's.
I have lived in this town in the foothills of Georgia for 20 years, and I would run into people in shops who knew me very well, and Lori, I had no idea who they were. My personality began to change.
Julie also learned no cure or viable treatment exists for the disease.
I even contemplated ending my own life. And I think prayer brought me to the point where I realized what I was learning from mainstream medicine just wasn't true. I began to believe in this voice that was telling me there was something I could do.
She tried the Bredesen protocol, got back to normal, and has stayed there ever since.
What he does is identify and address every person's contributor to their symptoms. It's just plain old common sense, and my experience shows me that it works.
Sally Weinrich tells a similar story.
I forgot to pick up my grandchildren twice, one morning in the morning for school, within a month period of time.
5 years ago, Sally also considered suicide after experiencing the unmistakable signs of Alzheimer's.
I had 2 relatives die from it, really 3 relatives die from it, on both sides of my family. I knew I was at risk for it. I had a dread for it.
She believes God led her to Dr. Dale Bredesen.
I had all of the Dr. Bredesen's causes of Alzheimer's, and I think in my case, my Alzheimer's would have progressed very rapidly.
Instead, the opposite happened.
The best thing about my Alzheimer's today is I have answers for it, and I have reversed it. And it is wonderful. I love life. I enjoy life.
Sally, Julie, and 5 others describe their amazing reversals in The First Survivors of Alzheimer's, how patients recovered life and hope in their own words.
They gave their specific protocols because they are personalized. Here's what each person did, how they did it, what their workarounds were, etc.
Over 2,000 people are currently on the plan. Clinical trial results released in 2020 showed 84% of plan participants with mild cognitive impairment experienced improved cognition. 12% continued to decline, and 4% showed no change.
In the people in our trial that we recently published, we actually saw increase instead of decrease in their gray matter in their brain. So you can actually see that there's improvement not only in their test scores, but also in their MRIs.
The first step of the protocol is the so-called cognoscopy to determine a person's individual risk of cognitive decline. This involves a computer quiz to assess your mental capability, as well as a number of blood tests to identify which areas a person needs to make changes.
And often there are 10 or more, and then we target those with a precision medicine sort of approach.
For most, that involves a low-carbohydrate diet, intermittent fasting, plenty of exercise, sleep, eliminating toxic exposures, as well as hormone and nutrient balancing.
Identifying those things and addressing them is how we see these people surviving so well.
It's a lot of effort and some expense, but people like Sally and Julie say it's better than the alternative. Lori Johnson, CBN News.
Slipping through the cracks at the southern border. When we come back, one mother's harrowing story of how a border policy led to her daughter's murder.
A surge at the southern border, and not the kind traditionally reported on. Multiple Republican governors are sending National Guard troops to help combat human trafficking and drug smuggling. Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin announced today 100 guardsmen from his state will head down, citing the fentanyl crisis and other criminal activity, as well as the need to help Texas in the fight against both. Meanwhile, Iowa Governor Kim Reynolds is also deploying about 100 National Guard troops, and Florida is sending 1,100 law enforcement agents and guardsmen.
Well, this could have been anyone's daughter. That's a quote from a mother of a 21-year-old woman raped and killed in Maryland. The man arrested, an MS-13 gang member who crossed the U.S. border illegally.
The words of Tammy Nobles still resonating after she spoke to lawmakers on Capitol Hill with asking for stricter border policies and saying that her daughter would still be alive today. CBN's Caitlin Burke brings us this story.
More than 1.5 million known illegal gotaways have successfully crossed the southwest border undetected. These include criminal gang members, drug dealers, and individuals on the terrorist watch list. That is not a secure border. That is not a closed border.
Please remember, the border is simply a transit location. It is not a destination. These people and these things are going to every city, town, and state across this nation.
Lawmakers also heard testimony from Tammy Nobles. Last year, police arrested an alleged MS-13 gang member for raping and killing her 20-year-old daughter, Kayla. The 16-year-old suspect had been apprehended for illegally crossing into the U.S. and then allowed to go live with an aunt in Maryland.
When he was arrested for Kayla's murder, he laughed and smirked. For me, this is not a political issue. This is a safety issue for everyone living in the United States. This could have been anyone's daughter.
Nobles says she's sharing the nightmare her family experienced because nothing will change if people don't talk about the problem.
The United States government has to secure our border. We need to properly vet all border crossers. The government could have placed a phone call to authorities in El Salvador and found out that he was a gang member, but they didn't. If we had stricter border policies, my daughter would still be alive today.
Two Hispanic lawmakers recently introduced a rare bipartisan immigration bill. It details a 12-year path to citizenship for immigrants in the U.S. illegally, would provide funding for more Border Patrol agents, and proposes changes to streamline the asylum system. But despite the bipartisan nature of this bill, it's unlikely to make it very far. The Republican-controlled House vows not to take up any immigration legislation besides bills aimed at securing the southern border. Caitlin Burke, CBN News, Washington.
Thank you, Caitlin. You kind of want to sing it. It's a beautiful day in the Lego Hood. How a nostalgic neighborhood is gaining support from fans young and old. Next on Faith Nation. Well, we leave you with this. Fans of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood are familiar with Fred Rogers' TV living room, and to many it may even feel like their own.
Yeah, and now one Lego fan wants you to be able to recreate the iconic space in miniature. 31-year-old Matt Smith built a Mr. Rogers Lego prototype. It features Mr. Rogers' living room and kitchen on one side and the neighborhood of the make-believe on the other. Smith paying tribute to Mr. Rogers, who he says still brings out the best in humanity.
I've always wanted to live in a neighborhood with you, so let's make the most of this beautiful day. Since we're together, we might as well say.
The kit isn't available in stores yet, but with enough support on the Legos Idea website, it can become a reality. And I went on the website, it had about 64 comments, so picking up some steam, I think.
Yeah, for me, it combines two of my favorite things as a kid. I loved watching Mr. Rogers after school, and I love Legos, so it's like the best of all possible worlds.
I know, who can't love both?
That's right.
All right, that's going to do it for Faith Nation.
Have a great night. See you tomorrow.